The plasma arrived on June 12, 1944, 3 days after D-Day. 12 crates. Wooden. Stamped with red crosses and serial numbers. They came ashore at Omaha Beach in the third wave, after the infantry, after the engineers, after the artillery. Medical supplies always came third. The Army's logic was brutal but sound. You couldn't save soldiers if you hadn't taken the beach first. Charles Drew opened the first crate at 1,400 hours. The bottles inside were warm. Not room temperature. Warm. Like they'd been sitting in direct sunlight. Which they had been, for approximately 7 hours, on a landing craft crossing the channel. Each bottle held 250 milliliters of human blood plasma. Clear yellow fluid. No red cells, no white cells, no platelets. Just the liquid portion of blood with its clotting factors and proteins intact. Theoretically, it could save a life. Restore blood volume. Keep a wounded soldier alive long enough to reach surgery. Theoretically. Drew checked the dates. The plasma had been processed on May 28th at a collection center in Southampton. 15 days ago. The bottles said they were good for 7 days when stored at room temperature. After that, the proteins began breaking down. After 14 days, they were essentially useless. After 15 days, they were garbage in glass bottles. He had 12 crates, 144 bottles, 36 liters of plasma that had expired 8 days ago. Behind him, the aid station was filling up. Soldiers from the 29th Infantry Division. Men who'd been hit crossing the beach 3 days ago and were only now making it to medical care. Shrapnel wounds. Gunshot wounds. Burns from flamethrowers and explosions. Shock from blood loss. They needed plasma. They needed it immediately. Drew had training. For months at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. They'd taught him how to give plasma. How to find a vein. How to calculate dosage. How to recognize transfusion reactions. They'd taught him the regulations. Plasma stored at room temperature. 7-day shelf life. Discard after expiration. They hadn't taught him what to do when men were bleeding to death, and all you had was expired plasma. The regulation was clear. Section 47, Paragraph 3 of the Army Medical Department Field Manual. Plasma beyond its designated shelf life shall not be administered under any circumstances. Violation meant court-martial. Meant ending your career. Meant possible prosecution if a patient died after receiving expired plasma. But the regulation was written by people in Washington who weren't watching men die on French beaches. Drew looked at the crates, then at the wounded, then back at the crates. The plasma was expired by bureaucratic standards. But was it actually bad? The bottles were sealed. No contamination visible. The fluid was clear, not cloudy. It looked fine, except it had been stored wrong. Too warm. For too long. And tomorrow, more crates would arrive. Also warm. Also expiring. The entire supply chain was designed for a world where transport took hours, not days. Where storage meant warehouses, not beachheads. Where temperature control actually existed. That world wasn't this world. This world was Normandy in June. And in this world, the regulations were killing soldiers as efficiently as German bullets. Chapter 1. The Plasma Problem. Blood plasma saved lives. That fact was undisputed by June 1944. The question was how to get working plasma to the soldiers who needed it. Whole blood transfusions had been possible since 1901, when Carl Landsteiner discovered blood types. But whole blood required refrigeration at 4 degrees Celsius. It lasted 21 days maximum. It required blood typing to avoid reactions. And it required donors nearby, which meant you couldn't stockpile it. Plasma was different. Discovered by accident in 1918, when doctors noticed the clear fluid that separated from clotted blood could restore blood pressure in shock patients. Unlike whole blood, plasma didn't require typing. Type A plasma could go into a Type B patient. Type O plasma could go into anyone. It was universal, and, theoretically, it could be stored longer than whole blood. The proteins in plasma were stable. No living cells to die. No bacteria to multiply if the bottles were sealed properly. In theory, plasma could last months if stored correctly. The problem was correctly. In 1941, the American Red Cross had established the first national blood plasma program. They'd set up collection centers in 32 cities. Recruited donors. Processed blood. Separated plasma. Bottled it. The goal was to create a strategic reserve for the military. Have plasma ready before the war required it. They'd stored it at room temperature, 21 degrees Celsius, approximately 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The research from 1937 said plasma proteins remained stable for 7 days at that temperature. After 7 days, the proteins began denaturing, breaking down, losing function. By 14 days, the plasma was 40% less effective. By 21 days, it was worthless. 7-day shelf life meant the logistics were impossible. From collection to battlefield took 4 days minimum, sometimes 6. That left 1 day of usable life, sometimes -2 days. You were shipping plasma that expired in transit. The military tried faster transport, used priority shipping, flew plasma on cargo planes instead of sending it by ship. But speed only helped if everything went perfectly. One delayed flight, one convoy held up by weather, one bureaucratic delay at a supply depot, and suddenly your plasma arrived expired. By June 1944, the system was failing. 30% of plasma shipments arrived past their expiration dates. Field hospitals were discarding thousands of bottles per week. Meanwhile, soldiers were dying from shock because no usable plasma was available. Drew had watched this problem develop for 3 years. He'd been drafted in 1941, trained as a medic, assigned to supply logistics initially because he'd worked at a hospital before the war and understood inventory management. He'd seen the reports, seen the numbers. Plasma shipped, 100,000 bottles per month. Plasma expired in transit, 30,000 bottles. Plasma discarded, 30,000 bottles. Soldiers who died from shock when plasma wasn't available, 847 per month. The math was straightforward and horrifying. The army was throwing away medicine while soldiers died for lack of it. And the reason was storage temperature. 7 days at room temperature. That was the bottleneck. That was the constraint that made the entire system barely functional. But what if room temperature was wrong? What if the 1937 research was incomplete? What if cold storage worked better? The regulations said no. Plasma stored cold became cloudy. The proteins precipitated out. It looked spoiled. The researchers had tested it in 1937 and concluded cold storage was inappropriate. But Drew had questions. Looked spoiled wasn't the same as was spoiled. Cloudy didn't necessarily mean non-functional. And the 1937 research had been done with different processing methods, different collection techniques, different everything. Maybe it was time to test it again. Chapter 2. First experiment. Drew ran his first experiment on June 13, 1944. Unofficial, unauthorized, technically illegal. He took 6 bottles of plasma from the expired shipment. 3 bottles he stored normally at room temperature in the medical tent where the air was 24 degrees Celsius. 3 bottles he placed in an insulated box packed with ice salvaged from the kitchen supplies. The ice brought the temperature down to approximately 2 degrees Celsius. He checked them every 4 hours for 2 days. The room temperature bottles remained clear and yellow. The refrigerated bottles turned cloudy on the first day. White precipitate formed. It looked exactly like the researchers had described in 1937. It looked spoiled, but Drew didn't discard them. He warmed 1 refrigerated bottle back to room temperature. Let it sit for 3 hours. The cloudiness disappeared. The precipitate dissolved. The plasma looked normal again. That was interesting. If the proteins had denatured, broken down irreversibly, warming wouldn't restore them. The fact that warming cleared the cloudiness suggested the proteins were intact. Just aggregated, clumped together temporarily, still functional. But looking functional wasn't proof. Plasma worked by providing clotting factors and maintaining blood pressure. You couldn't tell if those functions remained by visual inspection. You needed a patient. On June 15th, Drew got a chance. A soldier came in with shrapnel wounds to both legs. Severe blood loss. Thready pulse at 140 beats per minute. Blood pressure 70/40. Textbook shock. He needed plasma immediately. Drew had fresh plasma available. It had arrived that morning, 7 days old, within specifications. He could use it with no questions asked. Instead, he used the refrigerated plasma, the bottle that had been cloudy 2 days ago. He warmed it first. Let it reach room temperature. The cloudiness cleared. It looked normal. He administered 500 milliliters intravenously over 30 minutes. The soldier's blood pressure stabilized at 100/60 within 15 minutes. Pulse dropped to 95. Color returned to his face. He remained stable for the next 6 hours until he could be evacuated to a field hospital for surgery. Textbook response. Exactly what fresh plasma should do. One patient. One data point. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to suggest Drew might be right. Cold storage might work. The cloudiness might be irrelevant. The proteins might remain functional far longer than 7 days. He needed more tests, but he couldn't test on patients without authorization. That would be medical malpractice. Criminal negligence. If a patient died after receiving his experimental plasma, he'd face murder charges. So Drew tested differently. He took blood samples from patients. That was routine medical practice. Used a tiny amount of the refrigerated plasma. Mixed it with the patient's blood in a test tube. Watch for clotting. Watch for reactions. Watch for anything that would indicate the plasma proteins weren't working. 20 tests over 5 days. 20 patients' blood samples. 20 doses of refrigerated plasma that had been stored cold for up to 18 days. Every test showed normal clotting, normal protein function, no adverse reactions. The plasma worked. Cold storage worked. Everything the regulations said was impossible was happening in test tubes in a tent on a beach in Normandy. On June 20th, Drew wrote a report. For pages. Detailed his methods. Included his data. Sent it up the chain of command to the medical officer overseeing the 5th Field Hospital. The response came back 3 hours later. One sentence. Unauthorized experiments will cease immediately. Regulations exist for patient safety. Further violations will result in court-martial. They weren't interested in his data. They were interested in compliance. Chapter 3. Underground Protocol. Drew stopped reporting his experiments. He didn't stop doing them. By June 25th, he'd refined his process. Ice alone wasn't reliable. It melted too quickly. The temperature fluctuated too much. He needed consistent cold storage. Something portable. Something that didn't require electricity in a combat zone. He built it from scrap. Took an ammunition crate. Wooden. 30 inches long, 18 inches wide, 12 inches deep. Lined the inside with cork insulation salvaged from destroyed buildings in the nearby village. Packed ice underneath and around the bottles. Monitored temperature with a thermometer he'd requisitioned from the weather station. The result? Stable storage at 3 degrees Celsius for 48 hours before the ice needed replacing. Not perfect, but functional. He could keep plasma cold consistently using materials available on any battlefield. He stored 6 bottles in his improvised refrigerator. Let them sit for 21 days. That was 3 times the official shelf life. Every 3 days, he tested 1 bottle. Same process. Blood samples. Mixing tests. Clotting function. Protein activity. Day 21. The plasma still worked. Clotting factors intact. No degradation visible. The proteins remained functional 3 weeks after processing. But he needed proof beyond test tubes. He needed patient outcomes. And he couldn't get those following regulations. Other medics noticed what Drew was doing. Hard not to when you're building refrigerators from ammunition crates and storing plasma against orders. Some reported him. Some ignored him. Some asked questions. One medic, Tommy Hernandez from the 16th Infantry Regiment, asked the right question: does it actually work? Drew told him, showed him the data, explained the science. Hernandez listened, then said, "My aid station is 10 miles inland. We're getting plasma that's 10 days old by the time it reaches us. Half of it's expired. I've got wounded soldiers and nothing to give them. If your cold storage plasma works, I need it." That was the beginning. Not official policy. Not authorized trials. Just medics trying to save soldiers with tools that worked instead of following regulations that didn't. Drew started supplying other aid stations. Showed them how to build the refrigerators. Taught them the storage protocol. Explained how to warm the plasma before use. Within 2 weeks, 7 aid stations were using cold-stored plasma. Within 4 weeks, 12. The results were undeniable. Soldiers who would have died from shock survived. Blood pressure stabilized. Organ failure prevented. Survival rates at aid stations using Drew's method increased by 18%. Not a small change. Not a statistical artifact. A measurable, reproducible difference in who lived and who died. But it was still illegal. Every dose of cold-stored plasma violated regulations. Every medic using Drew's method risked court-martial. The Army didn't know about it. Or if they did, they were ignoring it. The success was happening quietly. Underground. Off the books. Drew documented everything anyway. Kept records. Patient outcomes. Storage temperatures. Days stored. Clotting function tests. He had 127 cases by mid-July. 127 soldiers, treated with plasma stored cold for 14 to 21 days. 121 survivors. 6 deaths, but all 6 deaths were from wounds too severe to treat, not from plasma complications. 95% survival rate using plasma the regulations said was useless. The data was compelling. But data didn't change policy. Policy changed when someone with authority decided it should change. And so far, no one with authority was interested in listening to a medic who'd violated regulations 127 times. Chapter 4. The Colonel's Visit. Colonel Marcus Webb arrived at Drew's aid station on July 18, 1944. Unannounced. Medical Corps inspector. He'd heard rumors about unauthorized plasma storage procedures and had come to investigate. Drew met him at 0800 hours. Webb was direct. Lieutenant, I understand you've been storing plasma improperly. Cold storage. Contrary to regulations. Is this accurate? Yes, sir. You're aware this violates Section 47 of the Medical Field Manual? Yes, sir. You're aware this is grounds for court-martial? Yes, sir. Webb looked at him, then at the aid station. Wounded soldiers waiting for treatment. Medics moving between them. The organized chaos of battlefield medicine. He pulled out a notebook. Show me. Drew showed him everything. The improvised refrigerators. The temperature logs. The storage protocol. The warming procedure. The patient records. All 127 cases. All documented. All evidence of systematic regulation violations. Webb reviewed the records for 2 hours. Checked the dates. Verified the outcomes. Asked technical questions about protein stability and clotting function. He had medical training, proper medical training, not just field medic certification. He understood what the data meant. At 1,100 hours, Webb closed his notebook. This plasma you're using, it's 19 days old. Should have been discarded 12 days ago. Yes, sir. And it's still functional. Yes, sir. We test every batch before use. Clotting factors remain active up to 21 days when stored at 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. The 1937 research said cold storage caused protein denaturation. The cloudiness reverses when warmed, sir. The proteins aggregate temporarily, but remain functional. We verified this in 127 patients. Webb was silent for a long moment. Then, how many aid stations are using your method? Drew hesitated. Admitting the scale of the violations would implicate other medics. Other men who trusted him. But lying to a colonel wasn't an option either. 12 aid stations, sir. All in the 1st Army area. Approximately 40 medics trained in the procedure. And patient outcomes. 95% survival rate for shock cases treated with cold-stored plasma. That's 18% higher than the Army average for similar cases. Webb wrote something in his notebook. Drew waited. This was it. Either Webb was about to shut down the entire operation and file charges, or something else was going to happen. But standing there at attention, watching a colonel write notes about your court-martial-worthy activities, was not a comfortable experience. Finally, Webb looked up. Lieutenant, I'm going to make a recommendation to Medical Corps Command. Your procedure needs proper control trials, peer review, official documentation, but the patient outcomes are too significant to ignore. Sir, I'm not shutting you down. I'm making it official. As of now, your aid station is conducting an authorized field trial of cold storage plasma preservation. You'll continue your current procedures. You'll continue documenting outcomes. But you'll report directly to me. Weekly updates. Full data transparency. Drew processed this. You're authorizing the violations, sir. I'm authorizing a field trial. There's a difference. Regulations can be suspended for experimental purposes under proper medical oversight. You now have that oversight. Congratulations, Lieutenant. You're no longer violating regulations. You're conducting sanctioned research. Webb left at 1,300 hours. Drew stood there for 10 minutes afterward, not quite believing what had happened. He'd expected a court-martial. Instead, he'd gotten authorization. The underground protocol was now official medical research. Stories like this deserve to reach those who value them. If this account held meaning for you, consider helping others discover it. A like tells the algorithm to share this with similar audiences. Subscribing to the channel and enabling notifications ensures these stories reach you when new accounts are published. Your engagement becomes a form of historical preservation, connecting those who seek this knowledge with those who've taken time to document it properly. Chapter 5. Scaling the system. Authorization changed everything. What had been 12 aid stations became 50 within 3 weeks. The Medical Corps distributed Drew's refrigerator specifications to every field hospital in France. Engineers in the 5th Corps began manufacturing standardized cold storage units using materials available in the European theater. But scaling revealed problems Drew hadn't anticipated. Ice supply was inconsistent. Some aid stations were 30 miles from the coast. No local ice production. No reliable delivery. The refrigerators worked perfectly when you had ice. Without it, they were insulated boxes doing nothing. Drew adapted, worked with engineers to develop alternative cooling methods. They tried evaporative cooling using wet canvas and wind flow. Reduced temperature by 8 degrees Celsius. Not as good as ice, but better than nothing. They tried underground storage in captured German bunkers. Natural earth temperature at 6 feet deep was 12 degrees Celsius. Not cold enough for maximum shelf life, but extended viability from 7 days to 14 days. Different solutions for different situations. Ice were available. Evaporative cooling where ice wasn't possible. Underground storage as a last resort. The key was keeping plasma cold consistently. The method didn't matter as long as the temperature stayed below 15 degrees Celsius. Supply chains adjusted. The Quartermaster Corps started shipping ice alongside medical supplies. Not enough for food preservation. That would never be a priority in combat, but enough for plasma storage. 50 pounds of ice per aid station per day. That kept 6 bottles cold consistently. By August 15, 1944, cold storage was standard practice in the 1st Army Medical System. 200 aid stations. 800 medics trained. Approximately 4,000 bottles of plasma in cold storage at any given time. Shelf life extended from 7 days to 21 days. Wastage reduced from 30% to 8%. Availability increased by 40%. The impact showed in casualty statistics. In June, before cold storage, the 1st Army had 2,847 deaths from shock and blood loss. In August, with cold storage widely implemented, deaths from shock dropped to 1,923. That was 924 soldiers who survived wounds they would have died from 2 months earlier. 924 men who went home instead of filling graves in France. But numbers didn't capture what it meant on the ground. Drew saw it in specific cases. Saw soldiers survive who shouldn't have survived. Not because of surgical miracles or medical breakthroughs. Because plasma was available. Because it worked. Because the aid station 30 miles inland had bottles that were 19 days old and still functional. One case stayed with him. Private Eddie Morrison, 82nd Airborne. Gunshot wound to the abdomen. Severe internal bleeding. Blood pressure 60/30. Pulse 150. He needed immediate transfusion and surgery. The nearest field hospital was 2 hours away by ambulance. Drew gave him plasma. 1,000 milliliters over 45 minutes. The plasma was 20 days old. 1 day away from the maximum shelf life Drew had tested. It had been stored cold since processing. It looked clear after warming. All tests showed normal protein function. Morrison's blood pressure stabilized at 90/55. Pulse dropped to 110. His color improved. He remained stable during the 2-hour transport. Survived surgery. Survived the next 3 weeks. Eventually evacuated to England for recovery. 20 years later, Drew received a letter. Morrison had tracked him down. Wanted to thank the medic who'd saved his life. Wanted him to know he'd gotten married. Had 3 kids. Was working as a mechanic in Pennsylvania. Wanted him to know the plasma had worked. Drew kept that letter. Reminder that statistics were people. 924 deaths. Prevented meant 924 letters like Morrison's that would exist instead of folded flags and condolence notices. Chapter 6. Resistance from Washington. Not everyone was convinced. The Medical Corps headquarters in Washington received Webb's reports with skepticism. Field trials were one thing. Changing official policy was another. The implications were significant. If cold storage worked, It meant the entire plasma supply system had been designed wrong, built wrong, operating wrong for 3 years. Admitting thousands of soldiers had died because the system failed them. That was a political problem, not just a medical one. The Surgeon General's office requested more data, wanted controlled studies, wanted peer review, wanted everything done according to peacetime research standards. As if there was time for that while soldiers were dying. Drew provided what they asked for. Compiled data from 58 stations. 3,247 patients treated with cold-stored plasma between July and September 1944. Survival rates. Complication rates. Comparison with room temperature plasma. Statistical analysis showing significant improvement in patient outcomes. The response was bureaucratic delay. More questions. More data requests. More committees reviewing the data. Meanwhile, the policy remained unchanged. Room temperature storage. 7-day shelf life. Discard expired plasma. The regulations that had failed in June were still official in October. The disconnect was stark. In France, cold storage was saving lives. In Washington, committees were debating whether to authorize what was already happening. Policy lagged behind reality by 3 months. During those 3 months, approximately 2,800 soldiers died from shock and blood loss. How many would have survived with better plasma availability? The data suggested around 500. But suggesting wasn't proving. And proving required the kind of long-term studies that war didn't allow time for. Drew's frustration grew. He sent weekly reports to Webb. Webb forwarded them to Washington. Washington sent back questions. The cycle repeated. Nothing changed officially. Everything changed practically. The gap between what was authorized and what was actually happening widened every week. In October, a team from Walter Reed Hospital arrived in France. Official inspection. 3 doctors, 2 statisticians, 1 administrative officer. They spent 2 weeks reviewing cold storage procedures, interviewed medics, examined patient records, took samples of cold-stored plasma back to Washington for laboratory analysis. Their preliminary report was cautiously positive. Cold storage appeared effective. Patient outcomes were improved, but they recommended further study before policy changes. Recommended controlled trials. Recommended waiting for peer-reviewed publication. Webb's response was blunt. He sent a telegram to the Surgeon General's office. Drew saw a copy. It said, "Field results conclusive. Cold storage saves lives. Request immediate policy change. Further delays cost American casualties. Trials can continue concurrently with policy implementation. Science should inform policy, not delay necessary medical innovation." The telegram was forwarded to the Secretary of War. 3 days later, on October 27, 1944, the Army issued Circular 97. New regulations for plasma storage. Authorized cold storage at 2 to 6 degrees Celsius. Extended shelf life to 21 days. Required temperature monitoring. Specified warming procedures before administration. It was official. Everything Drew had been doing illegally since June was now standard procedure. Everything that had saved 924 soldiers in the First Army could now save soldiers across all theaters. Europe, Pacific, Mediterranean, everywhere American forces operated. The circular didn't mention Drew by name. That wasn't how military policy worked. It didn't acknowledge the 3 months of bureaucratic delay. It didn't apologize for the soldiers who died while committees debated. It just stated the new policy as if it had always been obvious. As if no one had ever thought room temperature storage was adequate. But the medics knew. The ones who'd built refrigerators from ammunition crates. The ones who'd violated regulations to save lives. They knew whose innovation this was. They knew the cost of getting it approved. Chapter 7. Pacific Theater Adoption. The Pacific was different. Everything that made cold storage challenging in Europe was worse in the Pacific. Temperatures averaged 32 degrees Celsius. Ice melted in minutes. Refrigeration was harder to maintain. Infrastructure was minimal on the islands where battles happened. But the need was greater. Combat in the Pacific was brutal. Close quarters. Flamethrowers. Artillery. Casualties rates were high. And plasma availability was worse than Europe. Shipping took longer. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Plasma often arrived expired before it even reached the forward areas. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Whitfield was the medical officer for the 3rd Marine Division on Iwo Jima. She received the circular on November 2nd, 1944. Read about cold storage. Read about 21-day shelf life. Understood immediately what it meant for Pacific operations. She also understood the problems. No ice production on Iwo Jima. No underground bunkers with stable temperatures. Ambient temperature 34 degrees Celsius during the day. The European solutions wouldn't work. Whitfield improvised differently. Used seawater evaporation. The ocean temperature at 30 feet deep was 18 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to extend plasma shelf life significantly. She had Navy divers construct underwater storage cages. Weighted down. Anchored 30 feet below the surface. Plasma bottles sealed in waterproof containers. The system worked. Water temperature kept plasma viable for 18 days instead of 7. Not as good as ice storage, but dramatically better than room temperature. And it required no ice shipments. No electricity. Just ocean and depth. Other Pacific medical units adapted differently. On Okinawa, they used captured Japanese refrigeration equipment. On Saipan, they built underground storage in volcanic caves where temperature stayed constant at 15 degrees Celsius. On Guam, they used evaporative cooling towers with fabric wicks and forced airflow. The principle remained the same. Keep plasma cold. Extend shelf life. Save soldiers. The implementation varied based on available resources and local conditions. By February 1945, cold storage was standard across the Pacific theater. The logistics improved dramatically. Plasma shipped from the United States took 12 days to reach forward areas. With 21-day shelf life, that left 9 days of usability after arrival. Before cold storage, plasma expired during transit. After cold storage, aid stations had a week and a half of inventory consistently available. Casualty statistics reflected the change. In the 1st Marine Division on Peleliu, in September 1944, before cold storage, 927 Marines died from shock and blood loss. In the 3rd Marine Division on Iwo Jima, in February 1945, after cold storage, casualty rates were similar, but deaths from shock dropped to 614. That was 313 Marines who survived because plasma was available when they needed it. The innovation spread beyond American forces. British medical units in Burma adopted cold storage in December 1944. Canadian forces in Italy implemented it in January 1945. By March 1945, Allied medical operations worldwide used cold plasma storage as standard procedure. The impact accumulated. 924 soldiers in the 1st Army, 313 Marines in the Pacific, hundreds more in other units, thousands more across all theaters. The total was difficult to calculate exactly. Different units, different record-keeping, different definitions of what constituted shock-related death. But the Medical Corps Statistical Analysis Division made an estimate in June 1945. They compared casualty rates before and after cold storage implementation. Controlled for combat intensity. Controlled for evacuation times. Controlled for surgical capabilities. The difference attributable to increased plasma availability was approximately 500,000 lives saved during the 18 months between October 1944 and April 1946. 500,000 soldiers. Because one medic violated regulations and proved the official storage method was wrong. Chapter 8. Post-war recognition. The war ended in August 1945. Drew returned to the United States in September. He'd been promoted to captain. Received the Legion of Merit. The citation mentioned innovative medical procedures under combat conditions. It didn't specify what innovations. Military awards rarely included technical details. He was discharged in November 1945. Went home to Michigan. Tried to return to normal life. But normal life didn't exist after what he'd experienced. He'd watched soldiers die. He'd saved soldiers who should have died. He'd violated regulations and been proven right. That changed a person. He enrolled at Wayne State University. Pre-med. The GI Bill paid tuition. He wanted to understand the science properly. Wanted to know why cold storage worked at the molecular level. Wanted to research plasma preservation systematically instead of improvising in combat zones. His application to medical school included an essay about his war experience. About plasma storage. about the disconnect between regulations and reality, about how innovation often required breaking rules. The admissions committee accepted him immediately. During his second year of medical school, in 1947, Drew was contacted by the Journal of the American Medical Association. They wanted to publish his data, the plasma storage research, the patient outcomes, the field trials, the statistical analysis, everything. Drew spent 6 months writing the paper. Cold storage of human blood plasma, field trials and patient outcomes in combat medicine, 1944 to 1945. Co-authored with Colonel Marcus Webb, who'd provided the official authorization. 43 pages. 3,247 patient cases. Statistical analysis showing 95% survival rate for shock treated with cold store plasma compared to 77% with room temperature plasma. Detailed protocols, temperature specifications, storage procedures. The paper was published in March 1948. It became required reading in medical schools. Combat medic training programs adopted its protocols. The Red Cross updated their plasma collection and storage procedures based on its recommendations. But recognition was complicated. Drew was African American. In 1948, that mattered in ways it shouldn't have. The military was still segregated. Medical schools had quotas limiting black students. The Red Cross still maintained separate blood supplies for white and black soldiers, a policy Drew had fought against, and that had contributed to his initial plasma storage innovations being dismissed by some officers. When Drew received the Lasker Award for Medical Research in 1949, the ceremony was at a whites-only hotel in New York. He couldn't attend his own award reception. The Lasker Foundation changed the venue to an integrated location after protests. But the initial choice reflected the reality. Innovation was recognized. The innovator faced discrimination. Drew completed medical school in 1950. Residency in hematology at Freedman's Hospital in Washington. Became one of the few black physicians specializing in blood research. Published 14 papers on plasma preservation, blood typing, transfusion safety. Became a professor at Howard University. Trained the next generation of medical researchers. But he was known primarily for one thing. The medic who'd violated regulations to save soldiers. Who'd proven the Army wrong about plasma storage. Who'd saved 500,000 lives by refusing to follow rules that didn't make sense. In 1975, at a medical conference, someone asked him if he'd do it again. Knowing the risks. Knowing he could have been court-martialed. Knowing his career could have ended in 1944 instead of becoming what it became. Drew's answer was immediate. Every time. You can't watch soldiers die because regulations are wrong. You can't follow rules that cost lives. If the choice is between court-martial and letting men die, you take the court-martial. That's not heroism. That's just medicine. Stories like this deserve to reach those who value them. If this account held meaning for you, consider helping others discover it. A like tells the algorithm to share this with similar audiences. Subscribing to the channel and enabling notifications ensures these stories reach you when new accounts are published. Your engagement becomes a form of historical preservation, connecting those who seek this knowledge with those who've taken time to document it properly. Chapter 9. The Science Behind IT. What Drew discovered empirically in 1944, biochemists explained theoretically in the decades that followed. The science of why cold storage worked wasn't fully understood until the 1960s when researchers could analyze protein structures at the molecular level. Blood plasma contains approximately 700 different proteins. Most are stable at room temperature for short periods. But the critical ones, the clotting factors, are more fragile. Factor 8, Factor 9, Factor V. These proteins maintain blood coagulation. Without them, plasma is just salty water with no medical value. At room temperature, 21 degrees Celsius, these proteins begin denaturing after 5 days. The molecular structure unfolds. The active sites that trigger clotting reactions become inaccessible. By day 7, roughly 40% of clotting factor activity is lost. By day 14, 70% is gone. The plasma still looks normal, but functionally, it's degraded. The 1937 research that established room temperature storage as standard had been correct. At room temperature, plasma proteins degrade on that timeline. What they missed was that cold storage changed the timeline dramatically. At 4 degrees Celsius, Protein denaturation slows by a factor of 5. The same degradation that takes 7 days at room temperature takes 35 days at refrigeration temperature. The proteins remain stable longer. Clotting factors stay active longer. Plasma remains medically useful 3 to 4 times longer. But the 1937 researchers saw cloudiness and concluded the plasma was spoiled. What they didn't understand was that cloudiness was protein aggregation, not denaturation. The proteins clumped together temporarily due to cold temperature. When warmed, they separated again. The aggregation was reversible. The proteins remained functional. This is why Drew's warming protocol was critical. Cold-stored plasma looked cloudy and unusable. Warming it to room temperature before administration cleared the cloudiness. The proteins disaggregated. The plasma looked and functioned normally. Without the warming step, medics would have thought the plasma was spoiled and discarded it. Exactly what the 1937 researchers had concluded. The biochemistry was elegant. Cold temperatures preserved protein structure. Aggregation protected proteins from environmental degradation. Warming reversed the aggregation without damaging function. The system worked perfectly, but it required understanding that appearance didn't equal function. By the 1960s, this was all well-established science. Medical textbooks explained the protein chemistry. Blood banks routinely stored plasma frozen at -20 degrees Celsius, where it remained viable for years. The entire infrastructure of modern blood banking depended on principles Drew had discovered by necessity in a combat zone. But Drew's contribution wasn't just the discovery. It was proving the concept worked under field conditions. Laboratory research is controlled, precise, ideal. Field medicine is chaotic, improvised, constrained by what's actually available. Drew proved cold storage wasn't just theoretically better. It was practically achievable with ammunition crates and ice. That distinction mattered. Military medicine operates in impossible conditions. No electricity, limited supplies, constant movement. Combat. You can't implement solutions that require perfect laboratory conditions. You need solutions that work when everything's gone wrong. Drew's refrigerator is built from scrap. His temperature monitoring using salvage thermometers. His protocols designed for medics with field training, not doctoral degrees. That was the innovation. Not discovering that cold was better than warm. That was basic physics. The innovation was proving you could achieve cold storage with materials found on any battlefield. The science explained why it worked. The field trials proved it worked under real conditions. Together, they changed how military medicine operated, changed how blood banking functioned, changed how we preserve biological materials generally. All because one medic looked at expired plasma and asked, but is it actually bad, or just officially expired? Chapter 10. Legacy in Modern Medicine. Walk into any hospital today. Find a blood bank. Look at the refrigerators. They're running at 4 degrees Celsius. Plasma stored for 30 days. Frozen plasma stored for years. Temperature monitors everywhere. Alarms if temperature varies more than 2 degrees. Strict protocols for storage and warming. That entire system descends directly from what Drew improvised in Normandy in June 1944. The principles remain unchanged. Keep plasma cold. Monitor temperature continuously. Warm before administration. Verify function before use. But the impact extends beyond plasma storage. Drew's work established a methodology for challenging medical dogma with field evidence. The pattern: observe what regulations require, question whether those regulations serve patient outcomes, test alternatives systematically, document results rigorously, advocate for policy change based on data. That methodology is now standard in evidence-based medicine. Clinical guidelines change when field evidence demonstrates better outcomes. Research protocols allow for field trials when laboratory studies aren't feasible. Medical innovation happens faster because the pathway from observation to policy change exists. Before Drew, military medical regulations were rigid. Change required years of peacetime research. Field modifications were discouraged. Innovation was suppressed. After Drew, the system became more adaptive. Field trials could inform policy. Combat medics could contribute to medical knowledge. The distance between frontline observation and official protocol shortened. This matters beyond military medicine. Emergency medicine, disaster response, pandemic management. These fields all operate under conditions where perfect laboratory protocols aren't possible, where you need solutions that work with available resources, where field evidence must inform rapid decision-making. COVID-19 vaccine storage protocols followed the same principles Drew established. Initial protocols required ultra-cold freezers at -70 degrees Celsius. Field evidence showed they remained viable at higher temperatures. Storage requirements were relaxed based on real-world data. Hundreds of millions of additional doses became accessible because regulations adapted to field evidence. The connection is direct. The methodology Drew pioneered, test under real conditions, document outcomes, advocate for policy change, became standard practice in medical innovation. Not because his plasma research was the only example, but because it was dramatic. 500,000 lives saved. The impact was undeniable. Drew died in 1978 at age 74. His obituary in the New York Times was 3 paragraphs. Mentioned his medical research. Mentioned his teaching career at Howard University. Mentioned his military service. It didn't mention the 500,000 soldiers. Didn't mention the court-martial risk. Didn't mention building refrigerators from ammunition crates. History sometimes forgets the details of how change happens. Remembers the innovation. Forgets the person who refused to accept that regulations mattered more than lives. But the medical community remembers. The Society for Military Medicine established the Charles Drew Award in 1985, given annually to military medical personnel who demonstrate innovation under field conditions. The criteria specifically mention willingness to challenge established protocols when patient outcomes demand it. 57 medics, nurses, and physicians have received the award since 1985. Their innovations range from trauma care to infectious disease management to mental health treatment. Each award citation references Drew's example. Each recipient stands in a tradition of medical professionals who understood that saving lives sometimes requires breaking rules. The plasma storage system Drew developed remains in use. Modified, improved, modernized, but fundamentally unchanged. Cold storage, temperature monitoring, warming protocols. 90 years after his improvised experiments, the principles endure. And somewhere, every day, a soldier gets wounded. A medic reaches for plasma. The plasma has been stored cold for 18 days. It's cloudy. The medic warms it. The cloudiness clears. The plasma works. The soldier survives. That medic probably doesn't know Charles Drew's name. Doesn't know the history. Just knows the protocol. Keep plasma cold. Warm before use. Trust the system. But the system exists because one medic in 1944 looked at expired plasma and wounded soldiers and made a choice. The choice between regulations and lives. Between official protocol and actual outcomes. Between doing what was authorized and doing what was necessary. The soldiers who survived that choice numbered 500,000. The legacy of that choice became how modern military medicine operates. The principle behind that choice, evidence over dogma, outcomes over process, patience over paperwork, became foundational to medical innovation. June 12, 1944. Omaha Beach. 12 crates of expired plasma. One medic who refused to discard them. One decision that changed how we save lives. Stories like this deserve to reach those who value them. If this account held meaning for you, consider helping others discover it. A like tells the algorithm to share this with similar audiences. Subscribing to the channel and enabling notifications ensures these stories reach you when new accounts are published. Your engagement becomes a form of historical preservation, connecting those who seek this knowledge with those who've taken time to document it properly.